"Is that really your rank, sir?" the officer asked with a soft scoff, as the flag rope clicked once and coffee poured somewhere behind the folding chairs. They mocked him gently, pressed by protocol and smiles. An old man in the back row, while a few quiet laughs drifted and then hung. Still, when a worn badge caught the light, and the room answered with a held breath, silence thumped louder than any heartbeat. But quiet men leave echoes too, and that answer didn't need words. The Veterans Hall carried the smell of old wood and fresh coffee, the kind poured without measuring and refilled without asking. Folding chairs scraped softly as people settled in winter coats draped over their backs. Flags stood at the front, creased careful familiar. It was Veterans Day, the quiet kind, with no cameras yet and no speeches begun. In the back row sat the old veteran. He was 73, though no one had asked. His shoulders were narrower now, his hair thin and white at the temples. The jacket he wore had known better years, the elbows polished smooth by time. He sat with his hands folded, eyes lowered, listening to the low hum of voices and the shuffle of paper programs. A small group of officers moved down the aisle, checking names against a clipboard. They were efficient, practiced, polite enough. One paused near the back, glanced at the old veteran, and smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, just easy, familiar. The kind that came with being certain of your place in the room. So the officer said lightly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard, "What was your rank, sir?" A soft ripple of laughter followed. Not unkind, not sharp. Just the sound of people sharing a moment they didn't expect to matter. The old veteran lifted his head. For a second, his eyes met the officer's. Pale blue. Steady. Then he looked down again. He didn't answer. The officer waited, still smiling. Another beat passed. Someone nearby cleared their throat. A coffee cup clinked against its saucer. "Well," the officer added, still half amused. The old veteran nodded once, the way men do when they've heard a question before, and decided not to carry it any further. His gaze stayed on the floor. The officer shrugged and moved on, laughter trailing behind him like an afterthought. Chairs shifted. The room exhaled and went back to itself. When the old veteran adjusted in his seat, something small slipped from his pocket. It flashed once in the hall light before he caught it between his fingers. A coin. Old. Worn smooth. He turned it once, then tucked it back into his jacket, as if it had never been there at all. No one noticed. At the front of the hall, a volunteer straightened a row of chairs. A woman whispered to her neighbor about the weather. Somewhere near the side wall, the choir murmured as they found their places, pages rustling in quiet unison. The old veteran sat still. He watched the light move across the floor the way it always did at this hour, slow and patient. He had learned long ago not to rush moments like this. Behind him, a pair of men spoke in low voices. "Probably flew a desk," one said, barely audible. "Or nothing at all," the other replied, a soft chuckle following. The old veteran didn't turn around. He had heard worse. He had heard better. Neither changed much. At the aisle, a teenage volunteer glanced back at him, curiosity lingering longer than politeness required. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it and looked away. The officers finished their check and gathered near the front. The clipboard snapped shut. The room settled into a waiting hush, the kind that comes before something's supposed to begin. In the back row, the old veteran rested his hands, again fingers laced loosely. His breathing was slow even. The question still hung in the air unanswered, but it no longer pressed on him. It pressed on the room. And for a moment, just a moment, the hall felt quieter than it had before. The officers resumed their work as if nothing unusual had happened. Clipboards came back out. Names were called, checked, crossed through. Pens clicked. The schedule moved forward clean and orderly the way it always did. Choir and 10-1 officer said, "We'll need this aisle clear." "Yes, sir," a volunteer replied, already shifting chairs. The old veteran watched from the back row. He stood slowly and lifted one of the folding chairs that had been left leaning against the wall. "I can take this up front," he said, his voice low but steady. An officer glanced over. "That's all right, sir. Please stay seated." "I don't mind," the old veteran said. "We've got a process," the officer replied, not unkindly, but final. "Volunteers will handle it." The old veteran paused, chair still in his hands. He nodded once and set it back where he'd found it. A teenage volunteer stood nearby, a badge clipped crookedly to her sweater. She watched him return to his seat, confusion pulling at her brow. "They don't need help," another volunteer whispered to her. She didn't answer. At the front of the hall, a woman raised her hand. "There aren't enough programs over here." "We'll bring more," an officer said. "Please remain seated." The old veteran leaned forward slightly. "I know where they're kept," he offered. "Just through that door." The officer shook his head. "Sir, for safety reasons, we ask that attendees stay in their assigned areas." Assigned areas. The old veteran smiled faintly and leaned back again. But the room was tightening now. Chairs were misaligned. A man with a cane hovered near the aisle, unsure where to sit. Voices overlapped, polite but strained. The teenage volunteer stepped closer to the old veteran. "Sir," she said softly, "do you need anything?" He replied. "But that gentleman does." She followed his gaze. The man with the cane was still standing, weight shifting from foot to foot. "I'll help him," she said quickly. As she moved away, the old veteran adjusted his jacket. The fabric pulled open just enough to show a patch sewn inside faded thread colors softened by decades. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be seen. The volunteer noticed anyway. She slowed, then kept going. "Sir," an officer said sharply as the old veteran stood again. "Please remain seated." "I'm just guiding him," the old veteran said, nodding toward the front with the cane. "We've got it," the officer repeated. "Procedure." The old veteran let go of the chair he'd been reaching for. He stepped aside and watched as two younger men hurried over, awkward but willing. "Thank you," the man with the cane said, breathless. The old veteran inclined his head. Nearby, a woman leaned toward her neighbor. "They really don't like him moving around." Her neighbor shrugged. "Rules are rules." The officers regrouped near the podium, speaking in low tones. "We can't have people wandering," one said. "He's just an old guy," another replied. "But still." The teenage volunteer returned, programs in hand. She paused by the old veteran's row. "Sir," she said, hesitating, "they're starting soon." "I know," he said. "Take your time." She lingered a moment. "You didn't answer them earlier." He looked up at her, then eyes clear, unreadable. "Some questions don't need answers," he said. She nodded, though she wasn't sure why. At the front, the choir began to hum softly, finding pitch. The sound spread through the hall, smoothing some of the edges. The officers straightened their jackets and checked the clock. "Let's move," one said. The teenage volunteer took her seat near the aisle, but she kept glancing back. The old veteran sat where he'd been all along, hands folded, jacket settled neatly around him. The patch inside was hidden again. The room continued to move around him, busy and certain, and he remained quietly out of place. The first note from the choir wavered, then found its place. Chairs scraped again as people shifted, trying to make room where there was none. Someone at the front raised a hand. "We're short 3 seats," she said, "and the list doesn't match the head count." An officer frowned at the clipboard. "That can't be right." "It is," the woman insisted. "There are 2 names here with no chairs." A man with a walker stood near the aisle waiting. Another older woman leaned against the wall, purse clutched tight, eyes scanning for somewhere to sit. The old veteran saw it all. He rose without announcement. No one stopped him this time, maybe because no one noticed at first. He moved toward the stack of folding chairs by the side wall and lifted one, then another, testing their weight, as if measuring something only he could feel. "Sir," an officer started to say, then paused when the old veteran had already turned away. The old veteran carried the chairs down the aisle and set them neatly beside the empty spots. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate either. His movements were economical, practiced. "Ma'am," he said to the woman with the purse, "this one's for you." She smiled, relief softening her face. "Thank you." He nodded and turned to the man with the walker. "Take your time," he said, matching his pace. At the front, the officer checked the clipboard again. "Hold on," he muttered. "Let me see that." The teenage volunteer hovered nearby, watching. "I can help with the list," she offered. The old veteran stepped past them, pointing once. "Those 2 names were added yesterday. Handwritten." The officer looked up sharply. "How would you know that?" The old veteran shrugged. "Ink's different." There was a pause. A gray-haired man leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over a jacket older than the building itself. His cap was pulled low, shadowing his eyes. He had been quiet all morning, watching the room instead of the stage. He watched the old veteran now. "Choir needs a minute," someone called. The old veteran moved again, straightening a row of chairs that had drifted crooked. He picked up a dropped program and handed it back to its owner. When a microphone cable tangled at the podium, he bent and freed it with a single, practiced motion. No one had asked him to. No one stopped him either. The teenage volunteer stepped closer to an officer. "He's helping," she said, unsure if she needed permission to say it. "We'll manage," the officer replied automatically. The gray-haired man pushed himself off the wall. "He already did," he said quietly. The officer turned. "Excuse me." The gray-haired man nodded toward the aisle. "That gentleman. He's been fixing things all morning." The officer looked back. The old veteran was guiding another latecomer to an open seat, his hand hovering close but never touching. "Sir," the officer said louder now, "we need attendees to remain." The teenage volunteer spoke up, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's the only reason we're ready." The officer stopped mid-sentence. The old veteran finished what he was doing and returned to his seat. As he sat, his jacket shifted again. The faded patch inside caught the light for a second longer this time, threadbare, precise. The gray-haired man's eyes narrowed. Recognition flickered there, quick and contained. He said nothing. The choir fell silent, waiting for a cue that hadn't come yet. The hall held its breath. Even the officers seemed unsure what to do next. The old veteran folded his hands and looked forward, expression unchanged. Then the room went still. The hall did not restart the way it usually did. No one gave the cue. No one cleared their throat. The quiet that followed was thicker now, edged with attention. One of the officers stepped forward again. His tone had changed. The smile was gone. "Sir," he said, holding the clipboard against his chest, "your rank." Every head turned. The old veteran looked up. He did not speak. For a moment it seemed as if he hadn't heard. The officer waited, then repeated the question slower this time. "Your rank, sir." The old veteran rose. The movement was unhurried, careful, as if he were standing at home from a familiar chair. The sound of metal legs scraping the floor carried farther than it should have. He reached to the front of his jacket. No one said a word. He opened it and slipped his hand inside, fingers moving with quiet certainty. Then he placed something on the table beside the podium. A badge. Not new, not polished for display. It lay flat, catching the light without trying to. The edges were worn smooth, the lettering sharp, but unpretentious. It was the kind of thing that had been carried more than it had been shown. The old veteran stepped back half a pace. He said nothing. The room held. The choir did not breathe. The hum of the lights seemed louder. Somewhere near the back, a chair creaked as someone shifted without meaning to. The officers stared. One of them took a step backward. Not consciously. Not in retreat. Just enough to make space. The second officer mirrored him a beat later. No one apologized. No one asked another question. The clipboard lowered slightly, forgotten. The teenage volunteer felt her throat tighten. She had never seen a room change like that before. Not with noise. Not with force. Just with the quiet weight of something placed where it belonged. Near the wall, the gray-haired man straightened. His cap came off in his hand. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply watched, eyes steady as if confirming something he had suspected all along. The old veteran closed his jacket. The badge remained on the table. No one touched it. The officer nearest the podium shifted his stance, feet aligning, shoulders squared. The change was subtle, but it carried meaning. He cleared his throat, then seemed to think better of speaking at all. A woman in the second row pressed her lips together, eyes bright. Someone else leaned forward, trying to see without seeming to stare. The old veteran returned to his seat. He did not look around to see who was watching. He did not reclaim the badge. The hall exhaled. A hand rose near the front, then dropped. The schedule was no longer in charge of the room. Neither was the clipboard. The gray-haired man moved at last. He crossed the aisle and stood beside the table, not blocking the view, not drawing attention. He glanced at the badge once, then looked at the officers. "That'll do," he said quietly. They stepped aside, not away from the old veteran, away from the space he had claimed without asking. The teenage volunteer felt something settle in her chest. She didn't know what rank meant in that moment. She only knew that the question had finally been answered, and it hadn't required a single word. The choir director raised her hand slowly. "Shall we?" she said, tentative. No one objected. As the first note sounded again, it carried differently now, softer, truer. The badge stayed where it was steady in the light, and no one asked another question. The ceremony resumed without announcement, as if everyone had silently agreed on a new rhythm. An officer stepped to the aisle and gestured toward the front row, his movement careful, almost deferential. "Sir," he said not loudly, "there's a seat here." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an order. Just an opening. The old veteran looked at the place being offered. A chair near the center, close enough to see the flags, clearly close enough to hear every word. He hesitated for a moment, then rose and moved forward. People shifted to make room. No one rushed him. As he passed, heads dipped slightly. Not bows, not salutes. Just small acknowledgments traded quietly. He took the seat and folded his hands again. His face remained unchanged. The officers returned to their positions, but the angles were different now. They stood with less urgency, more attention. One leaned down to whisper to a volunteer instead of snapping instructions. Another adjusted the program order without comment. No one said sorry. They didn't need to. The choir sang, and this time the notes settled easily into the room. The sound filled the corners, smoothing what had been sharp. A woman in the third row closed her eyes. A man near the back wiped his glasses and put them back on carefully. The teenage volunteer watched the old veteran from her seat near the aisle. When the song ended, she stood and slipped away quietly. A few minutes later, a cup of coffee appeared on the small table beside the old veteran's chair. Fresh, hot, black, just the way it had been served all morning. He looked up to see the volunteer standing there, hands clasped behind her back. "Refill," she said softly. "Thank you," he replied. She nodded and returned to her seat, relief easing her shoulders. The gray-haired man with the cap took a chair a few rows behind him. He didn't speak, but his presence felt intentional, like a punctuation mark. As the program continued, people leaned toward one another, whispering in low tones. "Did you see that badge? I think I've seen something like it before." He didn't even say a word. Heads nodded. Conversations drifted, then quieted again. The officers moved differently now. One offered his pen when a speaker's notes slipped. Another held the door open longer than necessary for latecomers. Small gestures, unremarkable on their own. Together, they added up to something else. The old veteran listened to the speeches without expression. He did not straighten when his name was mentioned in passing. He did not look for the badge still resting where he had left it. During a pause, the gray-haired man leaned forward. "Coffee any good?" he asked. "Always is," the old veteran said. "That's what I thought." They shared a brief glance, nothing more. At the close of the ceremony, people rose slowly, lingering, as if reluctant to break the moment. A woman pressed the old veteran's arm lightly as she passed. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head. Outside, the afternoon had softened. The diner across the street glowed through its windows, a familiar warmth spilling out. Someone suggested lunch. Others agreed. An officer held the door open as the old veteran stepped out, hand resting on the frame a moment longer than required. "Take care, sir," he said. "You too," the old veteran replied. Across the sidewalk, the volunteer waited, coffee cup still in her hand. "Are you heading to the diner?" she asked. "In a bit," he said. She smiled and walked on. The old veteran stood for a moment, breathing in the cool air. Around him, the town resumed its gentle pace. Cars passed. Someone laughed. A bell chimed faintly from the diner door. Justice hadn't arrived with punishment or praise. It had arrived quietly, in the way people moved, the way they made room, the way they chose not to ask another question. The old veteran adjusted his jacket and followed the others down the steps. No one rushed him. No one needed to. The library was quiet in the afternoon, the good kind of quiet that carried footsteps gently instead of swallowing them. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily above long wooden tables. Near the entrance, a bulletin board had been cleared and wiped clean. A small plaque had been mounted there. It wasn't polished to a shine, just brushed metal, warm in color, with a simple line etched beneath a name. No dates listed, no rank spelled out, nothing that demanded attention. People stopped anyway. The teenage volunteer stood a few steps back, hands folded in front of her, reading the plaque again. She had seen it earlier that morning, but it felt different now, here in the quiet. Across the room, the gray-haired man sat in a chair by the window cap, resting on his knee, as he watched the light shift across the floor. The old veteran stood near the shelves, scanning the spines as if he had all the time in the world. The volunteer glanced between the plaque and the man by the window, then took a few steps closer to him. Her voice was low, careful, without the edge of humor it had once carried. What rank was he? The gray-haired man didn't answer right away. He followed her gaze to the plaque, then to the old veteran by the shelves. His expression softened the way it did when something long settled finally came to rest. "The kind you don't announce," he said. The volunteer nodded as if that made sense now. The old veteran selected a book and brought it to the desk. The librarian checked it out without comment, sliding the card back across the counter with a small smile. "Take your time," she said. "I always do," he replied. Outside, the town moved at its usual pace. A delivery truck idled and pulled away. Somewhere down the street, the diner door opened and closed, a bell chiming faintly each time. Inside, the smell of coffee lingered familiar and steady. The volunteer followed the old veteran out onto the steps. He paused, looking down the street, then up at the sky. "They put something up," she said, gesturing back toward the library. "I know," he said. She hesitated. "It doesn't say much. It says enough." They stood together for a moment, neither in a hurry. Across the square, the gray-haired man joined them, slipping his cap back on. "You headed anywhere special?" he asked. "Just home," the old veteran said. "Mind if I walk with you a bit?" "I wouldn't." They moved off together, unremarkable in the way men do when there's nothing left to prove. The volunteer watched them go until they disappeared around the corner. Later, someone else would stop at the board and read the plaque. Then another. Word would travel the way it always did in small towns, quietly, person to person, without announcement.